Good morning, everyone. It's so stimulating to see such a great turnout as we start off our new program season. It's my honor and privilege to introduce to you Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, who is the former Special Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence and also the former Director of the National Counter-Proliferation Center. Ambassador DeTrani served in the State Department before he joined the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and while at State, he was the U.S. Special Envoy to the six-party talks on North Korea. Before his service with State, Ambassador DeTrani had a distinguished career at the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was a member of the Senior Executive Service, and his Washington-based assignments were multi and varied, and let me just give you a sense of them. He was Director of Operations for Southeast Asia, Director of European Operations, Director of the Office of Technical Services, Director of Public Affairs, Director of the Crime and Counter-Narcotics Center, and also Special Assistant to CIA Director William Casey. Ambassador DeTrani has lived abroad, primarily in Southeast Asia and China, and is fluent in Mandarin. And we could not be more fortunate than to have him speak to us today on this very timely topic. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador DeTrani.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great being here. I guess, well, I know the UN Security Council passed that resolution knowing you were having this meeting. So they did it on Monday evening, so we could tee that one up. So good job. They made that resolution, and this was the impetus to get them going. You know, before I get into the subject, this is part of the subject of North Korea. As Joe indicated, I've done a number of things. I've focused a lot on nuclear issues, but some of the history for North Korea is important. And I think that what I want to say is, this is a country, the Korean Peninsula, the Korean people, you know, over 5,000 years of history, culture. For Korea, 2,000 plus years have been recorded. 2,000 years of recorded history. And when you look at that recorded history, you're looking at significant vulnerabilities to the neighbors, those big neighboring countries, like China, like Russia, like Mongolia, like Japan. And the number of occupations, literally being occupied over 500 times over that 2,000 years of recorded history, over 500 times being if you will, invaded and occupied. And remind you, this is in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, no longer a colony of Japan. So there's a mentality in North Korea, and that's no surprise that it's called a hermit kingdom, because you had to live with these big countries that, especially being a neighbor to China, that had significant capabilities. They were always looking at you as a vassal state. And if you were providing the tributary and so forth, we'll take care of you and so forth. There's a mentality, there's a history. And when we look at China, and the Chinese tell us very clearly, we've had over 100 years of humiliation by the West and by Japan, starting with the Opium War in 1839. We've been humiliated, and now we're finding our stride. And it's no surprise that someone like a Xi Jinping would have over 80% popularity, because it's national pride, nationalism. Now, patriotism is great, but when you move into nationalism and it becomes excessive nationalism, that gets that's a little concerning. It should be concerning. It should be disconcerting to a lot, because that lends itself to elements of if you will, of reach, and maybe. But looking at the historical part of it is so important. And so when I look at North Korea, and I've been working in North Korea since 2003, as Joe indicated, as a special envoy, but I was also an associate director of national intelligence responsible for the Korean Peninsula, and indeed North Korea, and then with the National Counter-Proliferation Center, and with the director of national intelligence. a lot of focus was on proliferation, non-proliferation issues, and Korea was central. Why is Korea central? Because Korea is capable of proliferating. Korea is capable of inciting other countries to go their way. Korea retaining nuclear weapons and us accepting that is a message to South Korea, a message to Japan, a message to Taiwan. Maybe you need your own nuclear deterrence capability. And again, with our extended nuclear deterrence commitments to these allies, we're saying you don't. Because with the non-proliferation treaty regime that we've all signed up to, that's not where we want to go. We want to go to a world with fewer nuclear weapon states. And those originally 5 nuclear weapon states, their commitment was to move away from the nuclear weapons. That's arms control. And eventually not to have nuclear. And that was President Obama in the Czech Republic in 2009, a world with no nuclear weapons. That's what we aspire to. Well, the trend was to go in that way. So North Korea retaining and us accepting, because I know that's part of the discussion going on today, you know, even if they cap it, we accept it and we'll watch it and so forth. The fact of the matter is it will incite other countries, certainly in the region and beyond, to go nuclear. And then there's also that piece of miscalculation, accidental use of weapons, but also proliferation, selling what you have. And if you don't have much to sell, you'll sell what you have. And with North Korea, you're talking about a country that did work with Syria, going back to what the Israelis did in September of 2007. They took out Al-Kabar, a plutonium nuclear facility that the Syrians were building with the aid of North Korea. Now that is proliferation, ladies and gentlemen. So we have to be mindful of that. But let me scroll back on that. So there's history here. We're dealing with a North Korea, but not only a North Korea that's strong on the sense of national pride, but that's for the whole of the Korean Peninsula, but also with a xenophobic leadership. Very few of their leaders have even left the country. They know, and indeed very few of their people have left the country. They know us from what they hear. And what they hear is not the internet, it's an intranet, it's what they hear from within, and so forth. So there's a lot of history here. We are at a tipping point with North Korea, and I'll get into that tipping point, because the tipping point could be where with true escalation and the possibility of even greater tension and maybe even conflict. That's a reality. We have to face the reality. That's a reality. Or there is something, because there is an off-ramp, and that other off-ramp could be we could reestablish, reconstitute a dialogue. Now, many would say, why would you even want a dialogue with North Korea? Because it's never worked. For 25 years, it has not produced anything. Well, let me go back. Let me go back where we were at critical junctures twice before, and we were able, we, the corporate we, working with South Korea, working with Japan, and indeed working with China, we were able to defuse the situation. In 1993, North Korea was saying they were going to make Seoul, South Korea, a sea of flames. And what generated this was we had the IAEA monitoring their facility in Yongbyon. Yongbyon is where they do the plutonium reactor. And they weren't giving access to some of the monitors, the inspectors, the IAEA monitors. And there was a sense that they were holding something back. The North Koreans got upset with that. And they said, we're not going to give you access. And indeed, if you persist, we'll pull out of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we'll make Seoul a sea of flames. We'll just go off the reservation. Well, that was diffused. That was President Jimmy Carter, working with Billy Graham, who met with Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. And that was the beginning of the agreed framework process. And what we got North Korea and the United States to agree to, in talks in Geneva, led by our Ambassador Bob Gallucci, was that they would freeze the Yongbyon facility, no plutonium, and we would build 2 light water reactors for them at Kumho, North Korea, for civilian purposes, civilian nuclear reactors. Energy, because North Korea needs energy. At one time, North Korea was the model for East Asia. At one time, North Korea was the model. When you look at the late 50s and the 60s, countries in East Asia, certainly Southeast Asia, looked to North Korea as the model because that was the industrial hub. And now, in many ways, economically, it's pretty devastating. It's just gone the other way. But that was, so there was this tension. It was diffused with the agreed framework. We did light water reactors, give them heavy fuel oil until we built those light water reactors. Okay, so that's 1994. So everything stopped from 1994. And then in 2002, we confronted them with what we knew to be happening in North Korea. They were pursuing highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. That's in violation of the agreed framework, certainly the spirit of the agreed framework. And we said, look, what are you doing? And that ended everything. That was the end of the agreed framework. We stopped building those light water reactors. We stopped shipping heavy fuel oil. They took out over 8,000 spent fuel rods, and they started to reprocess these spent fuel rods for plutonium, fissile material for nuclear weapons. And they pulled out of the NPT, the only country to pull out of the NPT. North Korea pulls out of the NPT. Very tense. So in April of 2003, this is October 2002, it starts the process out of the agreed framework. And in April of 2003, because it was tense, here's a country reprocessing spent fuel rods for fissile material to build nuclear weapons. They're telling us. He said, here it is. Come up to New York. We'll tell you what we're doing. That's the thing with North Korea. We say it's a black hole and we don't understand what's going on. A lot of what we see is they tell us. They tell us about their nuclear program, their missile programs. It's out there. They want us to know. And what happened was China, and I have a little piece in the Washington Times that mentions this. I don't particularly like the title they put on it, but that's beside it. But what China did, at our request, and this was Secretary Colin Powell, our request to Li Jiaxing, the foreign minister in China, was to get the Chinese to tell the North Koreans, look, sit at the table with the United States and we'll sit there with you and listen. And let's see if we can work something out. And we did. We started the six-party process. And that was from 2003, the first meeting in August, until 2005, September, we had a joint statement, and North Korea committed to comprehensive, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. In return, now let's go back to what I was saying historically, in return for security assurances. Because when you're a small country living in this environment, you're fixating on security. And that's the issue. Because when they see our joint military exercises, they see military exercises that are there from their optic to decapitate the leadership. From their optic, we're in South Korea so that we and the South Koreans can go and take over North Korea. No, that's not the case. Those are defensive joint military exercises and so forth, but nonetheless, so security. So with the joint statement of September 2005, we're talking about a peace treaty. We're talking about the security assurances they need, economic development assistance. We're talking about issues that and energy assistance, eventually the provision of light water reactors, and so forth. But the sign up on here is for comprehensive dismantlement of their nuclear programs. Very, very central to the whole thing. They signed up to that. They signed up to that. And then at the end of 2008, it ended. And why did it end? Not too dissimilar from the agreed framework in 1994. Because we said our monitors, to verify that you're dismantling, need to leave the facility and look at other locations in the country, right? Because if you're committed to that, IAEA monitors to prove and to verify that you're not in the business of building nuclear weapons need to get out of areas that they just put you in. The Iran program, you're going to have a speaker talking about the Iran JCPOA that we have with Iran. That's part of it, where the IAEA monitors can leave those designated facilities, give the host government enough time, and say, we'd like to go there, and we'd like to take samples, and we'd like to see what you have. The North Koreans orally agreed, but when we asked them to put it in writing, they said no. So we stopped. That was it. It was the end of 2008. And so from 2008 into 2017, we've had literally zero communication. We've had some. We had the agreement, 29 February 2012, where we thought we had a moratorium on missile launches, and they put a satellite in orbit in April with the new leader. So that's a little the background. So I guess what I'm getting at is, when we talk about an off-ramp, and when some of us, myself included, talked about the value of dialogue, that we've had dialogue. And we know some of these people, a lot of them who know some of these people. And although we've had dialogue, we've been frustrated because 25 years we haven't gotten to where we are. And where are we now? Well, it's much worse than it has been. I mean, because North Korea has gone beyond the pale. They've gone beyond the pale. Where are we now? We just saw over this past year, this year alone, 15 missile launches. We've seen a nuclear test going back a few weeks ago, right? A few weeks ago. A nuclear test on the 4th of September, which by, at least my assessment anyway, certainly over 100 kilotons, probably was a hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear event. It's very significant. So we're seeing missiles to include intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach Chicago, Denver, intermediate range ballistic missiles, 4,000 to 7,000, 6,000 kilometers that go up to Guam, and the ICBMs that can reach the US that go over 10,000 kilometers. We've seen submarine launch ballistic missiles. We've seen significant, in 1 year, development in this area. Because what Kim Jong-un, the new leader, 5.5 years, going on 6 years of leadership, what he's doing, very clearly, is racing, literally racing, to build a nuclear weapons capability that could touch the world, and certainly the United States. So when you have a capability that can touch the United States, and you speak about a nuclear deterrent capability, who are you deterring? In this case, it would be deterring the United States, because you think twice, the country has nuclear weapons, you're not going to, and they immediately cite, meet with the North Koreans, track 1.5s, these are former Ambassador Bellucci, myself, before him, Ambassador Bosworth, before he passed away, we would meet. These are informal, unofficial discussions with their senior leaders, some of their Ministry of Foreign Affairs leaders, and so forth. But they cite Libya, and they cite examples of Saddam, and they say, when you give up your nuclear weapons, you're vulnerable. And the security assurances you provided to these people meant nothing, because eventually Gaddafi was in a hole, and they pulled him out and killed him. Same thing with Saddam. So we're saying that's North Korea, you're not living there. And ultimately we're talking about normal relations. But North Korea, what they've done is not only race to get a nuclear weapons capability, missile launches, over 15, that's unreal. His father, Kim Jong-il, over a period of time, didn't have that number of missile launches. And to have an intercontinental ballistic missile now, and the sense that they could miniaturize their nuclear weapons, and they could mate it to a delivery system, now could it re-enter our atmosphere and not burn up? That's problematic, that really should be tested. Now, any scientist, any technologist would say, yes, you have to test it, because you don't want it blowing up on the pad, and you don't want it blowing up when it's not supposed to blow up and so forth. You want to test it. So they haven't tested it, so they don't really have that capability. So they're not an existential nuclear threat to the United States because they don't have that capability, haven't tested. Some would counter that by saying, thank you very much, Mr. DeTrani, that makes a lot of sense. But there's no guarantee they would do that, because they don't necessarily march to the same tune we do. And if they feel desperate enough, they may try something. And so we should not just be comfortable that we still have, in our allies in South Korea and Japan say, North Korea has your attention now, really has your very close attention now. And without saying it, because they're so polite and they're such great allies, you say, but they've always been an existential nuclear threat to us. With the no-dons, the scuds, and so forth. Now it's touching the U.S., and correctly so. We say, look, we've always been there with our extended nuclear deterrence commitments, with the nuclear umbrella, we're always there for you. There's no question about that. And that's something we have to get on. So it's not only the nuclear program, missile program, and they sell missiles. Look what they sell those missiles to Iran, to Libya, to Syria, and so forth. We've not seen it with the nuclear except for Al-Qabar and what have you. But there's also the cyber capabilities. We saw it with Sony Pictures, what they did at Sony. If you're sitting in Seoul, you'll know what they did to the banks in Seoul when they took some of the money out of some of the major banks. And so significant cyber capabilities. But they're looking at a menu of asymmetrical capabilities. So it's not just nuclear, although that's horrific, devastating, hopefully never use. So when we talk now about that, and when there's a discussion going on in Washington now, throughout the country, and in Seoul, South Korea, about maybe tactical nukes. Do we redeploy tactical nuclear weapons into South Korea, which were there until President George, H.W. Bush in 1991 made it very clear there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea. And that's true. Everything was out and so forth. To redeploy there. And I personally, having worked it, I certainly would not go that way. We have commitments to our allies in South Korea, to Japan, and again, it would just move us in a direction. So we're dealing with a North Korea with significant nuclear, missile, asymmetrical, cyber, chemical, or biological capabilities, to include conventional weapons that are really looking at Seoul. The Kaesong Heights, we're talking about 30 miles. They could just launch those immediately. But we're also looking at something else, ladies and gentlemen. Governance. Because human rights, and we've seen some of that. We've seen it from the UN, and we've seen it from other organizations. We've seen it from some defectors and so forth. The gulags that are in North Korea, the plight of some of these North Koreans who are suffering in that, living in that country, and so forth. So human rights issues. So when we had agreement with them in September 2005, we said, you got to be aware of something. If you ever want to normalize, because North Korea wants to normalize relations with the United States, their key objective is normalize relations with the United States. Treat us the way you treat Pakistan, except the fact we have nuclear weapons, and we will not use them. And you, again, treat us the way you treat Pakistan, you'll be happy with them. So that doesn't work. That doesn't work. And the fact is, you're not going to have normal relations with the United States, even if you. This was 2005. Even if you do nuclearize, because there are other issues. Now, we could have liaison offices, interest sections, and so forth. You need to be transparent and have progress on human rights issues because we have values. And what we see on human rights issues goes against the values of the United States. And if you're going to normalize with the United States, these issues can't resolve overnight, we understand that, but there needs to be transparency and movement towards progress. To include illicit activities, you can't be counterfeiting our cigarettes. You can't be counterfeiting pharmaceuticals. In the past, they were counterfeiting our $100. You got to get out of this criminal behavior and so forth. So there's a menu of issues that have to be addressed. And for the Japanese also, the abductees, where they've taken Japanese nationals and just took them and sent them to North Korea and disappeared. And then President Shinzo Abe and his predecessors have always insisted we need transparency and we need to rectify the situation, and certainly for South Korea also. So there are many issues with North Korea. Look, there are two paths available, in my view, where we are right now. We just saw the UN Security Council, new UN Security Council resolution this past Monday. That's a very powerful resolution. It's really capping, and North Korea needs energy. They don't have any energy right now. Well, they're working on a grid that was built by the Japanese going back, but decades ago. The infrastructure is falling apart. They need the energy, and this comes from China, where China provides the crude, refined petroleum products, the crude oil, and so forth. They need it. They get over 90% from China. So this new UN Security Council resolution is capping to about 8.5 million barrels a year, which is about 30% less than what they were normally getting. And a lot of this comes from, almost all of it comes from China. A little from Russia, but mostly China on that. That's significant. Textiles. North Korea's gotten in the business of textiles. Close to, 750, close to 750 million, something like that. Textiles mainly going to China, about 80% that goes to China. No longer can you export the textiles, capping your energy and so forth. Vessels, if any nation state sees a North Korean vessel or believes there's illicit cargo on a vessel, with the approval of the country that's flying the flag on that vessel, to board those vessels and determine if there's North Korean cargo on that. And so it's a very broad resolution. It's a very intrusive resolution. It's a resolution that will really cut back on the resources that North Korea gets from the sales they make of fisheries and certainly iron ore. They're not selling coal any longer to China. The former resolution, China is not taking coal. So they're hurting economically. There's no question about it. And this other one, the new resolution, will really bite. And it will really affect their infrastructure now, although it's capped. And we all know this is the compromise the Americans made, we made with North Korea, but basically with China and Russia. Because China and Russia said, basically, if you cut off the energy that goes into North Korea, the refined petroleum products, certainly the crude oil, everything stops. And you're talking about potential for instability. So the compromise was capping it and moving forward. So it's very significant. So what are we looking at? We're looking at, I think, two paths. One path is North Korea continues. Now, there will be a response to this resolution on Monday night. The North Koreans do respond. And when they say we will respond, the one thing you can bet on is they will respond. They're pretty consistent. That's what I'm saying. People say, but you don't know a lot about what's going on. They do know a lot about what's going on. They tell you, we're going to launch missiles, they launch them, we have a nuclear test, they launch them, and they're going to respond. They will respond. There probably will be another missile launch, probably another ICBM, because they need to work on that ICBM that touches the United States. They're on the cusp of making it very clear to the United States we have the capability that will get you. So you stay away from us. This is the security thing. This so-called extended, if you will, their nuclear deterrence capability. And so we will see that. An intermediate range ballistic missile that could reach Guam. I mean, you know. So we will see that. So North Korea will persist. And what's our response to that? Our president has said very clearly, everything's on the table. Everything's on the table. General Mattis has made that everything's on the table. I think many of us believe, and I think General Mattis has said this, but I think that China needs to, and I think they do understand this, and North Korea needs to understand very clearly, a preemptive strike against a nuclear, but a ballistic missile that potentially has a nuclear warhead or conventional on it is not only something that the international law permits, because countries are permitted to defend themselves and their people. It's something that the people would demand. Sit here and watch a missile being launched that has an ICBM or an intermediate range capability, and if the intelligence, if the information is, it could, or it does, or it could have a nuclear or conventional warhead on it, you have no choice but to take it down. That's preemption. Preempt an imminent threat. If it's imminent threat, an obligation. It's not only a right you have, it's an obligation we have, and so forth. So North Korea needs to understand that. And how they respond to that is going to be very interesting. Because with that will be a declaratory policy. You don't want to respond to that. Because you're threatening us and we're doing that. Now, having worked with the North Koreans all these years, they will respond. We saw this in 2010 when they took down a frigate, a South Korean frigate on the northern limit line and killed 47 sailors. And they went into one of the islands, they occupied the island, they killed a few civilians. They'll probably do something like that again. And so forth. What I'm getting at is the escalatory process here, where there's an element here that things can, and this is the concern, the communication systems are not working the way they're supposed to be working, and maybe the grid's not working the way it's supposed to be working when you're in the midst of a cold winter in South Korea. Who knows? Who knows? But they have capability, and they will do it. That's the escalatory part, and that's always something. But we have many tools available to us. It's not only preempting something of that nature, it's the missile defense systems that we put in place, the THAAD, if you will, the Aegis systems that are in place, the Patriots in place. We have, and we will enhance our missile defense capabilities, and in South Korea, Moon Jae-in is very, in the beginning he talked about, let's look at that. The terminal high altitude area defense is something that's controversial. Let's look at it. Well, he has seen clearly what North Korea's been doing. So there is that impetus now, let's move on missile defense. Also joint military exercises. Bring Japan into those joint military exercises. Maybe Australia. And make it very clear we're not. And this is where North Korea is. Their goal is very clear when they talk about peace treaty and so forth. That means to them, you get out of South Korea, get out of the peninsula, and stop those military exercises. Cease and desist. That's obviously not going to happen. Even with the peace treaty, I don't believe it would happen. But that's not the point. The point is that's where the demands are. We will enhance those capabilities. Missile defense, joint military exercises, secondary sanctions. China is a big country. And China's doing quite a bit. I think China takes a bad rap a lot from the media and so forth. China is doing a bit. They are taking the coal. They are applying some of the sanctions, the resolutions that impose sanctions on North Korea. But it's a big country, and our point is you got to up your game, because you have banks and you have entities in China that are dealing with North Korean elements that are involved with illicit activities. And that's moving some of the sanctioned materials that we're talking about, and so forth. So that's secondary sanctions. Now we've sanctioned, the U.S. has sanctioned the Bank of Dandong and some other entities in China, telling China very clearly that if you don't do it, we're going to do it. Because that's impossible. And now, and China is doing a lot, and I give a lot of credit here. I do go back to what I said about April of 2003, where China brought North Korea to the table, and we started the six-party process. China saying, look, we could bring them to the table, and we heard the freeze for freeze. If you stop your military exercises, they come to the table. And many of us, I think all of us are saying, that's not symmetrical. It makes no sense. Our joint military exercises are with an ally that we've had for decades. They're defensive in nature. And what they're doing when they're launching missiles and having nuclear tests are in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and they're members of the UN Security Council. It goes against international law, and you're saying that's equal, we should stop that? No, we're not going to do that. They should just come to the table, and when you're at the table, take the gun down. Don't launch missiles, don't have nuclear tests. Now, it could be one day of exploratory meetings, it could be a week, it could be something. So we have a lot of tools available to us to include what we just did on this past Monday with additional sanctions and so forth, but that means it heats up. So that's that prospect. Many would say that's sort of where we are, and that's probably where we're going to be going. Because you have a leader in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who took over when he was 28, 29. He's been there going close to 5 years, or 6 years I should say, who's been pretty brutal. One would say very brutal. I mean, his uncle, Jung Sung-taek, was not only purged, he was executed brutally. His half-brother, the ex-nerve agent in Kuala Lumpur International Airport, reported large purges of CUs in the Korean Workers' Party, the Korean People's Army. And so this is a leader, a young man, who has been very, very brutal. And fear, I think, in my view, permeates some of that environment there. So there's always that element of uncertainty. I think he's a rational actor. Survival is key. I think he, and he says the right things. He wants North Korea to be respected and so forth, and no one is taking that away. And there's no question that it should be there. So is there an off-ramp, though? And I think what we've heard from Secretary Tillerson, I think President Obama has moved in that direction. We were not able to do that. Is there is an off-ramp. And Secretary Tillerson is saying, look, we no longer make talks with North Korea conditional. In the past when we were saying we'll talk to you, North Korea, but you have to agree to denuclearization. Okay? So come on to the table, we'll talk to you, but we want you to say you're prepared to move with denuclearization. And so forth. And the Koreans say, no, we're not going to do it, because we're not going to denuclearize. It's in our constitution now, Yongjin. We're going to have two things. We're going to have a robust nuclear program and economic reforms, economic development. So we can never get off the ground. Right now, we have no conditions. We're saying let's have exploratory talks. Let's see if we can stop what we're doing now, because what we're doing now is with them racing with to get to these capabilities, it's a danger. It's a danger. And so forth. It's a danger of miscalculation or something untoward happens and so forth to diffuse what's going on now. So the off-ramp is, okay, we could sit down, have exploratory, don't be launching missiles during these exploratory talks. It could be one day, it could be a week, it could be a month. And let's see if we can go to normal negotiations with other countries, South Korea, Japan, Russia, China, and so forth. Let's see where we can go on that. And maybe just stop it and move forward. Because North Korea needs all of the above. They need international. Right now, they're, we know so well, a pariah state. They've been isolated. The 193 countries beating the UN right now, and to a country. I can't think of, short of a few countries saying they understand what's going on. You may sympathize ideologically with what's going on there, but you can't agree with the process that we're following. Because it's in the face of everything, certainly in the face of the United Nations, where we're talking about a regime of peace in the world. And that's not where it's going. So the offer would be coming off, eventually a peace treaty. Doesn't mean we pull out of South Korea, and we move towards a more, normal relations, maybe intersections, liaison offices. Let me remind everyone here, and it's not, the media, I kind of criticize the media because I think there's an obligation on the media to bring as much current historical perspective to the issues, because these are not, black and white cases. It's not so linear. It's more complex than that. But let's remember, it was not only the agreed framework in 2005, we had the Perry process. We had Madeleine Albright, our Secretary of State in Pyongyang. We had our Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, meeting with Kim Jong-un. We had Vice Marshal Joe in the White House with President Clinton. Remember the one with all those medals? Went to the floor. I felt sorry, couldn't stand up because of those medals. Look, this is 2000, ladies and gentlemen. We had a president who was thinking, President Clinton, when the election came in the way, of actually visiting Pyongyang. That's 2000. So we've had, periods where there was an element, and we were talking about an intersection in our respective capitals. We go that close. So is this the impossible? Is this not reachable? I maintain we have to work at it. I don't know that it is reachable, but we should strive for it. Indeed, we need to stop what's going on right now. Because what's going on right now, and ladies and gentlemen, I'll end on this and then open it up for discussions. If we relent, and this is where North Korea is, we'll wear you out. We'll keep working at you. And eventually, you're going to sit down, although they've been talking about Pakistan for years, eventually you're going to sort of sit down and, when Pakistan got their nuclear weapons and they had nuclear tests, what did? We sanctioned them, we did all the right things, and eventually we sort of sat back. Eventually we said, okay, this is a reality. Let's watch them. They're part of the NPT, they're monitors. Eventually North Korea says, that's what we'll get. And that, their program is capped, and they're not producing any more fissile material, nuclear weapons. They still have, and the assessment now is it could be up to 40 nuclear weapons. That's not, compared to the US and Russia, it's nothing, China, nothing. That's significant, because they have delivery systems and so forth. Even one is significant. And it's not only the proliferation of other countries going that way, and the nuclear arms race, and the ability of some of that stuff getting out and possibly inadvertently being used, but also getting into the hands of bad actors, either rogue state or terrorist organizations. And let me end on that point. We do know terrorist organizations have, certainly Al-Qaeda, they've sought nuclear weapons, nuclear technology, fissile material, bombs and things of that nature. We don't want, the world is tense. There's such disarray out there, and there's so many bad actors, these non-state bad actors, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth. We just don't want to be compounding any of that, so we just got to work on that. China, I'll end on this note. I think China, and that's the piece I have today, I think China should do what they did in April of 2003. They have a lot of leverage on North Korea. They have a significant amount of leverage. And in 2003, when they brought North Korea to the table, coincidentally, they had mechanical problems with their pipeline that was providing crude oil to North Korea. It just happened. So they weren't getting the crude oil, and it turned out that the North Koreans had come to the table, and then the pipeline was reestablished. So, that's pretty powerful stuff when you have leverage of that type. China is not our, a puppet of the U.S. They just don't march to our tune, but it's in China's interest, and China is very much so is in agreement with us. Comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible dismantling of North Korea is what they want. They don't want a nuclear North Korea, but they also don't want instability and so forth. So why don't we sort of open it up? We can have a little, I may have gone over. If I did, I apologize on that. Why don't we open up for questions and discussions? Sir. They are strained. China is. Can you say this? The question is China and North Korea strained relations? Absolutely. So relations are strained. And Kim Jong-un, to the surprise of everyone, has been somewhat dismissive of China and its leader Xi Jinping. I mean, he has not visited, and he's made it very difficult for China. China's going into the 19th Party Congress in October. They don't need North Korea that's going off the reservation and going beyond the pale. So relations are very strained between China and North Korea, no question. Please, sir.
Given the isolation of North Korea, how have they gotten the technical capability to do all these things?
Yeah, that's a very good question. North Korea, going way back, it's the Soviet Union. When you talk about nuclear capabilities, missile capability, it was the Soviet Union. They sent a lot of their engineers, their scientists to Moscow to study. A lot of the technology for their Scuds came out of the former Soviet Union. The research reactor that was established by the Soviet Union, and the Soviets insisted they be part of the NPT to do that. And it was until the implosion of the Soviet Union in 1991 that stopped. And then you had people like A.Q. Khan, a serial proliferator in Pakistan, who provided highly enriched uranium capabilities and so forth to China, but also to Iran and to Syria and to Libya, and what have you. And then there's also China's there. I mean, it's a big country, it's porous. They send students back and forth. So they did get the technology. In fact, they sent a lot of their scientists in North Korea to Khan research labs in Pakistan to understand what the technology is and so forth. So North Korea did work at this, but they've been working at it since Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, since the 60s, when China had their nuclear test, and then they got into the nuclear club, North Korea has been aspiring to be a nuclear weapon state. So they've been working diligently at that. Yes, sir.
Within the last couple of days, I heard a comment that South Korea was going to send a team in to try to take out Kim Il-sung. If they were successful in doing that, and it may be just a total fabrication, what happened to the leadership of North Korea?
Well, two things. One, that's a good question. I doubt that they would send the team in to take, but that's, that's the Republic of Korea has, their own capabilities. I just don't see Moon Jae-in, the new president of South Korea, doing that. I think Moon Jae-in his thesis is a very clear thesis. He's prepared more so than Park Geun-hye, whom he replaced, who had real politics. She was open to negotiations also, but North Korea was responding with nuclear tests and missile launches. I think Moon Jae-in wants to get a dialogue going. He tried mill-to-mill talks, and the North Koreans rebuffed it going back a few weeks ago. I just don't see the Moon Jae-in government doing what some of those rumors are of that. And indeed, we don't know what follows. We don't know what follows. Kim Jong-un has removed a number of people who were exposed. His uncle was exposed to China, Jiang Sung-tak. The Chinese knew him well. I don't think anyone has a good sense of what would follow Kim Jong-un. I just don't. But moreover, I don't see that scenario. So.
Yeah, recently Vladimir Putin made a rather blunt statement that the North Koreans would rather eat grass than give up their nuclear capability. I don't know if you adhere to that. I mean, if so, doesn't it imply that neither sanctions nor incentives and talks would work? And if that's what it implies, then I guess I'm not sure what alternative he was suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised hearing that from Russia. I mean, being Russia is part of the six-party process, then certainly China is committed to comprehensive denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So we're very clear when we talk to the North Koreans, it's the Korean Peninsula. We're talking about denuclearization, just not North Korea, and there are no nuclear weapons in the South. Eat grass, the North Korean people are capable of eating grass. We've seen significant malnourishment outside of Pyongyang, the provinces. We've seen starvation in the 90s, where we're talking about up to maybe 1 million or more people dying of starvation. There's malnourishment and so forth. We have a lot of NGOs who are in there, with Mercy Corps and Linton, and a lot of great groups who are working on tuberculosis, getting food in. We, the United States, in the 90s, got more food aid into North Korea than any other country. And then, could you imagine, the United States? This is humanitarian aid, because what you just said, because the people who were suffering, and they eat grass. Now, when you put eating grass with nuclear weapons, I don't know that the people would prefer eating grass than having nuclear weapons. I think there is a sense of pride. I think in Iran there's a sense of pride. We are a nuclear weapon state, and look at where, and there is that element, you play that element of nationalism, certainly patriotism, so there is that element there. But we're the adults. Russia's the adults. And it shouldn't just be either or. Either you have nuclear weapons and you don't have to eat grass, but if you get rid of your nuclear weapons, you're going to. It may be what Putin is talking about is Kim Jong-un and his philosophy with Pyongyang, and I think that's probably where President Putin is talking about, that this President Kim Jong-un is not going to, and I think that's our assessment. I don't think we disagree with that. I think our assessment is he's not going to give up his nuclear weapons. Doesn't mean he won't stop. Doesn't mean we won't be on a path where maybe we could get there. It's going to take years, maybe decades to get there. But we got to, got to take that first step. We got to move forward on that. Yes, please.
When our State Department, our government says all options are on the table,
Right.
does that mean there are positive options as well as negative options?
Yes, there are. All options.
What are they?
Well, President Trump has said he'd be honored to meet with Kim Jong-un. And we're prepared. Well, thank you. He said that. We have Secretary Rex Tillerson has made it very clear we're prepared to sit down with North Korea to talk about these issues. That's that option. That's the off-ramp option. There is an off-ramp there for North Korea. Unconditional. We're not saying you got to give up your nukes before we sit down and talk to you on that. The other side is preemptive. If you launch something as an imminent threat, we're going to take it out, and everything else is on the left. So yeah, when he says everything's on the table, that's what he means.
What's the plausible mechanism of action for these economic sanctions that we brought into, that we put in place? To the gentleman's question a minute ago, if we accept that Kim isn't going, regardless of what kind of deprivations are imposed on his people, abandon this policy, and if we accept that repression, unlike say Iran, repression is so systematic in North Korea that it's impossible for the people, given those deprivations, to rise up from below and change things? Is there perhaps a different subset of the repressive establishment that's a little more amenable, that we're trying to bring power in place of Kim? What are we trying to do?
Those are good points. Those are very good points. Sanctions are biting, and these certainly will bite, because some of the revenue they're not getting will not go to their nuclear and missile programs. Just think about all those missiles they launched. 15 missiles in this year. And the nuclear, that's a lot of money. They're putting a lot of money. So some of the resources they're getting goes to that. Some of the resources they're getting are going to the elites. So some of that will dry up. So it slows the program on the missiles, the nuclear. The elites may be not driving in those big fancy vehicles and what have you. So there's a piece there where sanctions start to bite. Hopefully they're not affecting the citizens, the people. Mind you, you have two North Koreas. You have Pyongyang and then you have the provinces and what have you. So there is that aspect. There is another aspect. And you alluded to that. I mean, where the elites and others would be saying, look, we're being contained and we're isolated. We don't even have our ally China there now, although there's a peace and friendship treaty, or Russia. Is this the way we want to go? So hopefully these people may have some influence on Kim Jong-un. Who knows? The question was asked there is that what would follow Kim Jong-un? We don't know, but maybe, look, when Kim Jong-un came in, there was a sense that he would be more progressive, if that's the word, than his father, Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il was the one who signed the September 2005 joint statement. He's the leader who visited China 3 times his last year in 2011. And we said Kim Jong-un would be a little more progressive than that. It's gone the other way. So maybe what would follow would be that. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but we know one thing. It will bite. And it will get those who are facilitated. Those who facilitate, the question asked a minute ago, getting materials into North Korea that shouldn't be going into North Korea to support their nuclear and missile programs and so we'll be going after those countries, those vessels that are out there and so forth. And those countries that are not abiding by it, they will they would, get the international attention and criticism they deserve. So sanctions will not, and I think it's the core of your question, will not be the silver bullet that's going to resolve the nuclear issue in North Korea. It's got to be part of a menu, and that's missile defense, joint exercises, off ramps. That's the whole thing. You got to really open it up, and that's why some of the criticism with the strategic patience. Although President Obama did try when he came into office, he tried, and he was rebuffed. But then a period of 5-6 years where you're not talking, there's no dialogue, and they're sort of racing, and you're saying, wait a minute. So good questions, good points. We're hoping it has some effect. Sir?
In the last maybe 6-8 months, there's been 3 or 4 U.S. military vessels that have crashed into freighters.
Yes.
And I read a report that said each of those vessels had bad defense systems on it, and the speculation that North Korea may have actually infiltrated U.S. naval technologies or the freighters' technologies to cause some of those accidents. Is that just like fake news? It's good.
I think it's rumored out there. You see, I think the Navy has done some studies, and they do some good work when they do a post-mortem on events like that. And they're saying these were not cyber intrusion and so forth. I mean, these are heavily used seaways and so forth. And the sense is it wasn't a cyber intrusion or anything of that nature. But further than that, I don't know. Certainly, the Navy is drilling down very. And if indeed that was the case, they will know. We would know. But all indications now it was not an intrusion, a cyber intrusion, or something of that nature that affected the ability to navigate properly. That's the sense. I don't know if that's fake news, but I think that's rumored out there. Plus, it's a logical thing. Because if we just a minute ago we were talking about asymmetrical. That's part of asymmetrical. You don't know that we did it, but the money's no longer in your bank account. Right? You don't know that we did it. So many pictures. You don't have any pictures to have. We didn't do it.
The most sophisticated warships in the world, preventing anything from hitting it, and they run into a vessel.
Yeah, well, that's where the Navy is looking at it. Your points are really, but again, these are highly used seaways, and your points are on. If anything, the Navy's diligent on that. Please, yes, ma'am.
This Korean leader, if he must know, unless he's insane, that if he struck anybody,
Yes.
that we would obliterate his
Yes.
whole, doesn't he not care?
He cares.
Well,
He cares. He's not. But the sense is from people who have been watching him, and I support that. He's not suicidal. He's not suicidal. So he's going to take it right to the. They take it right to the point. They take it right to that point to ensure that, and that's why if there is a preemptive strike on a missile that's coming our way or to an ally, we take it down. He's got to think very carefully, because if he does something that will engender a massive response from the U.S., because General Mattis has said that. And our commander of U.S. Forces Korea said that. So you do something to our allies and something, we're going to take you out. I think he cares. He knows that. But he feels there's a certain, if you will, he has leeway, if that's the word, space that he could sort of occupy, which is short of inciting the U.S. to do what you're talking about. And that's the space he's working on. Sir, one more question, okay.
Ambassador, you began your speech talking about the history of
Yes.
the peninsula.
Yes.
Why are all the negotiations on a multilateral basis, why are the ROK and DPRK not historically having bilateral negotiations? And why is the ROK, is it our press coverage of it, or is the ROK not sort of taking leadership?
Very good question. On the contrary, it's North Korea. ROK, we want ROK to take the lead. And they have with the Pak Geun-hye and separated families and the Mount Kumgang visits and Kaesong, the major industrial complex in North Korea that they've invested in and so forth. We've encouraged North Korea to work with, because ultimately, look, it's reunification. Ultimately, it's reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And that's the concern. And we want the DPR, we encourage them to work with the ROK. The North Koreans insist on only dealing with the Americans. Because they have, their view is the Americans are occupying South Korea. We want you out. They call them the South Korea puppet of the U.S. and all that nonsense and so forth. So it's been them, and that's the six-party process where we brought the other countries in. And that's why, indeed, if we do have exploratory talks, and there's a sense of negotiations, the South Koreans certainly have to be at the table, and they should be at the table in exploratory talks, because this is a Korean issue. But the final analysis is, if we're looking at reunification, think about this, ladies and gentlemen, reunification, and ultimately, it's accepted that North Korea has nuclear weapons. And our allies in South Korea do not. They have conventional deterrence capabilities, but they have our extended nuclear deterrence commitments and so forth. Is that a level playing field? So if I'm sitting in Pyongyang, I think I may have the advantage on that. So we have to make sure it's a level playing field for allies in South Korea. And that's why comprehensive, verifiable, reversible dismantling is so important, and that's why they need to be at the table. And ultimately, reunification is a Korean issue. They need to come together on that. But it's been North Korea that's been holding off on those points. Look, it's great you're all interested in these issues, and this is the third this forum here. I've spoken to other World Affairs Councils. You really seized, and that's the way it should be, where the American public is intimate with it. We do look to our media to be as expansive and as insightful as possible, and I think with the President Trump administration, think what you want, but I think that he's getting the message out. We have our Secretary of State and others communicating, but it's the people, the American people who follow, who care, because it affects all of us. And your interest in these issues is gratifying, so thank you very much.